From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
President Trump ratchets up pressure on Iran, pledging it will be held responsible for any attacks by Yemen's Houthi rebels. We'll have more with Michael Allen of Beacon Global Strategies. Also, look ahead to Donald Trump's planned phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. That's set for tomorrow.
The Trump administration is facing accusations of defying a judge's order over deportation of Venezuelan gang members this weekend after invoking the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. Our political panel will join us with reaction.
Also joining us this hour, former Republican Congressman Patrick McHenry of North Carolina, former Canadian Parliament member Ruby Dhalla, as President Trump doubles down on his threat for additional tariffs coming April 2nd. Thanks for joining us on the Monday edition of Balance of Power. That is not where we start this evening, Kaylee, because we do have breaking news coming from the White House this evening with regard to the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, President Trump just announcing on Truth Social that he has picked Federal Reserve Governor McKee Bowman to be the Fed's next vice chair of supervision. Remember, this was a role held by Michael Barr, introduced the Basel III endgame back in 2023. She was widely critical of those higher capital requirements and is seen as someone who would be easier on banking regulation overall, assuming that she can be confirmed by the United States Senate. So for more on this breaking story, we turn to Bloomberg's Michael McKee, our international economics and policy correspondent. So, Mike, Bloomberg had reported that this move was likely, but what should we know about McKee Bowman serving in this role?
Well, she wouldn't be likely to be confirmed. She's already been confirmed as a Fed governor, so it is just the additional title as vice chair. So it shouldn't be too difficult for her. She is a Republican. She was appointed in 2018 by then President Trump to an open seat as a governor, filling essentially what is the small bank governor responsibility on the board. She was a Kansas bank commissioner, and she ran a family bank in Kansas for a number of years. So she has a lot of experience in that area, and she should be confirmed without any kind of dissent.
That was my next question, Mike. As the president writes, Mickey's been serving honorably on the Fed's Board of Governors since 2018, has great expertise dealing with inflation, regulation, and banking. Will senators see it that way?
I think they will. She's obviously very much sees things from a deregulatory Republican point of view. She has argued with Michael Barr about things like the supplementary leverage ratio and about additional capital required for banks, suggesting that the banks need to be tiered, that we need to give smaller banks less regulation than bigger banks. But overall, she is a product of the banking system, so it's a philosophical difference rather than any question about her qualifications.
Well, and we know that Michael Barr is going to still remain a governor, even though he will no longer be serving in this role, and it does raise the question of how the Fed in its entirety is going to be approaching whatever capital requirements look like from here, including the chairman, Jerome Powell.
Well, that is a big question for the banking industry because there is something called a Basel III endgame, which is a new set of regulations on top of previous ones that came out of the Basel Banking Working Group in Switzerland that would require higher capital levels for banks, for the biggest banks, basically. And those banks have been fighting that for quite some time, not only the capital levels, but the complexity of regulation. They got to the point where the Fed withdrew the proposal last year and reworked it and then put it out again, was planning to repropose it this winter. And because Michael Barr left, they have backed off on that. Now the question is, does it go forward at all, or does it get significantly reworked under new Vice Chair Bowman?
Bloomberg's Mike McKee in the clutch. We thank you, Michael, for the insights, as always, as we now add the voice of Patrick McHenry, the former Republican congressman from North Carolina, the former chair of the House Financial Services Committee, is with us at the table. I guess timing is everything. Great to have you here at a moment like this. So, ding dong, Basel III is dead. What does this really mean?
Exactly what the story
is. Change for the Fed, beyond that.
Change for the better. Yeah. Change for good. And so the takeaway here is that President Trump is nominated somebody who got a wide bipartisan vote of the United States Senate, to the Fed board. Number one. Number two, highly qualified. Number three, comes from the banking industry. I would call this a normative pick, right, in the broader set of politics of Washington. But a significant change for the Fed on how they're going to approach bank capital, with Michael Barr stepping aside without much of as a direct result of the election, frankly, but without a lot of consternation. He steps aside, and now you have somebody who's much more in keeping with where the banking industry is in America today, where the Fed is right now, and certainly where the Trump administration is.
So what would, in your mind, a more appropriate Basel III endgame, assuming we get a reproposal, look like under a Vice Chair of Supervision vote?
It would not be exceeding the European standards, which is Michael Barr's goal, not what he said, but what the policy looked like. It is a reworking from soup to nuts. Throwing it out, starting it over again, and making sure that it's a data-driven operation, not a politically driven, ideologically driven operation like Michael Barr put forward. The fact is, before the election, Michael Barr, his capital proposal, and I say his, he called the Basel III endgame, but it was his capital proposal, was roundly criticized by Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill and by his own peers at the Federal Reserve. It was dead before the election. And the nomination of McKee Bowman is one that the president's saying clearly we're going in a very different direction when it comes to banking regulation in America.
So why replace it with anything at all, then? This is the Trump administration.
Well, that's why
animal spirits.
That's what they need to do, is start from scratch, and build out policy from there. Certainly, addressing bank capital standards is a reasonable thing to do. We need to, instead of being rear-facing with our regulation, which is all we've been for banking regulation since the financial crisis. It was a debate about Dodd-Frank. Then, once the passage of Dodd-Frank, the implementation of the regs, and then the repeal of some of those regs on Dodd-Frank. McKee Bowman's appointment allows the Fed to pivot and be a forward-looking rather than rear-facing regulator, making sure that we don't have more bank failures, number one. Number two, ensuring that we don't have fewer banks in America today, which was the underlying premise of Dodd-Frank, frankly.
I'd like to be forward-looking on something else, which is remaining business that the Republican conference in the House is now going to contend with after successfully passing a Republican-exclusively negotiated continuing resolution last week, not just through the House, but through the Senate. And I'm wondering, Chairman, if the lesson learned here is that actually you don't need to negotiate with Democrats to reach a compromise, because at the end of the day, Democrats are going to provide the requisite votes on necessary bills like that, like, say, a debt ceiling fight going forward, even if you don't bring them to the table initially.
Well, since for the last 20 years, you needed to have Democratic votes to fund the government, out of the House and out of the Senate. What this showed, especially the House, and let me speak from my perspective here. We had a Speaker of the House kicked out for funding the government. We had a Speaker, and two-thirds of House Republicans voted to fund the government. But we had a small group, a rump group, that ousted Speaker McCarthy based off that premise that the continuing resolution was innately bad in and of itself. Right. You had only one dissenting vote out of House Republicans for a continuing resolution that continued Joe Biden's spending levels, the ones that these very same people, a third of them, just had voted against months before. But it was changed because, frankly, President Trump enabled the change in conjunction with Speaker Johnson and his leadership team counting the votes in the House. When the House passed any funding mechanism of any kind, it changed the whole game, changed the whole script out of Washington. It means that debt ceiling negotiations can be different. The House already passed a raising of the debt ceiling with the budget resolution. This means that this whole operation of Democrats having leverage is greatly dissipated. As you see, Chuck Schumer having to answer for from his constituents and on his book tour.
So it sounds like Democrats should not be waiting by the phone for the rest of this session.
Well, that's been their
Not that
play.
they were getting a lot of calls, obviously, but It was remarkable watching the markets rally on Friday because the government didn't shut down. We're at the point now we're celebrating a year-long CR, which I'm guessing you would not prefer. But the disconnect it also speaks to between Washington and Wall Street right now is pretty great. That was a relief rally because we've been selling off like crazy and took a big round trip that brought us back to before the election. Mr. Chairman, you're sensitive to the markets. What is going on with the White House, the confusion, the lack of cohesion in a message that convinces an investor?
No, well, that's a different story. So this is about tariffs. This is about the president's foreign policy. This is the president taking political pain as quickly as he can.
No pain, no gain.
No pain, no gain. And the best time to take political gain was yesterday, as far from the election as possible. And so the president is willing to take political pain. He is using his political capital and his current popularity among the American people and willing to do hard things right now. The markets are reacting to that, certainly. But the president is not indexing to the markets like he did in his first term. Right. That is different. And you have his two minds in two different approaches in his cabinet. You have Secretary Letnick and Secretary Bessent. And they both speak to a part of Donald Trump's thinking and approach here. And they're two very different personalities, but certainly part and parcel of how Donald Trump views the Rubik's Cube of this economic situation we're currently in.
Well, we know markets are forward-looking and discounting, and they don't seem to be forward-looking to the long-term growth or the positive benefits of deregulation and tax cuts that the administration seems to be talking about right there now. Are they mispricing it? Are the markets wrong? Or are the administration wrong in interpreting that the markets are only looking at the short term rather than the long term?
They're looking too much at the short term. The regulatory right sizing, the pulling back of regs will happen. What they're indexing to is the day-to-day of the Doge. And the Doge is the thing that's captivating people. Well, let's actually look at the long-term vision here. We have federal agencies that are dramatically more expansive than they were pre-COVID. We have a federal government that is more than 40% larger than it was pre-COVID. We have an inability to pay for the government services and the government that we currently have. So they're trying to bring efficiency to government. If you step back from the day-to-day and look at that goal setting, if they're successful, it will help. It will help with our debt markets, our indebtedness as American people. It will mean the tax cuts can be more robust if we can right-size the cost of government. But the day-to-day of this stuff is chaotic, and it looks chaotic because, frankly, it is, right? And there's no way to discount that. But the long-term objective here is the regulatory relief, is the tax relief, and that is what the administration's banking on long-term, and markets should bank on.
All right, Mr. Chairman, great to have you. As always, the former chair of the House Financial Services Committee and former Republican congressman from North Carolina, Patrick McHenry, here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. And coming up, we'll have Michael Allen of Beacon Global Strategies, who will help us preview Trump's planned phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin tomorrow. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Our message to Iran is you better take this president seriously, and I think the Houthis learned that the hard way this past weekend. There's a new sheriff in town, and this president is not just going to sit on his hands and allow terrorists to launch attacks on commercial vessels and U.S. naval ships.
That was White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt earlier today on a warning for Iran. Over the weekend, as she alluded to, President Trump ordered strikes against sites in Yemen controlled by the Iranian-backed Houthi militants after months of attacks against marine traffic in the Red Sea. Here with more is Michael Allen, managing director and partner of Beacon Global Strategies, with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. So in addition to the action over the weekend, Michael, we get a True Social post from President Trump today that reads in part, every shot fired by the Houthis will be looked upon from this point forward as being a shot fired from the weapons and leadership of Iran. Iran will be held responsible and suffer the consequences. Those consequences will be dire. Does that seem like a real escalation of what has been over a year long of this activity in the Red Sea?
It really does, because it felt like the Biden administration wanted to deal with one of the symptoms of the problem, which is let's get the people that are actually launching the missiles. I think Trump's is an acknowledgement of saying, you know what, all of these weaponry come from Iran, and let's begin to go up the ladder towards them. So at the end of the day, don't think it's so much about freedom of navigation, as important as that is, or the restoration of deterrence, as important as that is. I think it's more about sending Iran a message of the United States is very active in the region and is going to come after you if you're not ultimately cooperative on terrorism and your nuclear program.
It was only weeks ago that a man named Michael Allen sat at this table. It was the day that Benjamin Netanyahu met with Donald Trump at the White House, and you talked about their conversations about a potential preemptive strike about Iran.
Yes.
Against Iran, the nuclear sites specifically, knowing that there might be a window of opportunity here for the U.S. to take advantage of. That's been growing louder, and I'm hearing about it more and more ever since you put that on our air. Is this a continuation of the same conversation?
I think so, because people look in the region, they see Hezbollah is pretty much on its back, and Iran is thinking to itself, we got to get them back up as a deterrent force so that Israel doesn't come and bomb us. Yeah. The Israelis, took out many of the Russian air defense systems that would make it easier to get into Iran. So people start looking at these macro criteria and saying it's a propitious time to actually go after their nuclear program. The question is, though, are there two different clocks? A Washington clock, which is geared to Trump's maximum pressure campaign, and how long will that take, versus Israel thinking, I can't let this window of opportunity close on me? Or have they decided, hey, listen, we're going to give this a few months and then we'll do it together?
Well, when it comes to the Iranian nuclear program, we know there's been reporting that Russia has actually, or the administration has been talking with Russia about potentially being some kind of middleman in those conversations. And President Trump is going to be speaking with Vladimir Putin tomorrow. I'm not sure how heavily Iran will feature on the agenda when they're trying to talk about a ceasefire agreement of some kind in Ukraine. But do you anticipate that that will yield tangible results, that conversation tomorrow?
I think so. I think that President Trump is going to have to give Vladimir Putin some sort of assurances that he can say yes to the ceasefire without making them part of the ceasefire. I think that's what crafty Putin is trying to do. He's starting to say, well, I need Ukraine to commit to withdrawing from our territory, or I need Ukraine to acknowledge the territory that we, Russia, have taken from Ukraine is now part of Russia. And the Ukrainians, I think, are rightfully saying, like, well, hold on a second. We got pressured to come into a ceasefire. We had conditions that we would have liked to levy on this deal. Also, Russia can't sit around here and do it. So I think it's most appropriate for the mediator to say, Mr. Putin, this is going to come up in the courts of negotiations, et cetera, to coax him into the Trump framework. And then things get really hard because we've deferred all of these substantive issues to the longer negotiation of a peace deal, if that's even what you can call it.
So what do we call a success? Are you looking at how many hours they spend on the phone together? Because these can go pretty long. Will it be the readout, or will it be a meeting that's scheduled, a face-to-face meeting? Is that a win?
I think what a win will be for President Trump is if Putin hangs up the phone and says, you know what, I agree to a ceasefire without just
that would be a
heavy conditions. You know, I think there'll be some sort of understandings that will come out from the Kremlin over time that Trump agreed to this and Trump agreed to that, and we're not going to know for a little while whether that's true or not. I do think that definitely the president wants to meet with Putin, so I would look for that soon. But I think for tomorrow's call, maybe he just wants to sign him up to the Trump framework. But I wouldn't rule it out.
That would be a redhead, I think, if ever on the terminal. Kaylee, Michael, it's great to have you back. Michael Allen, Managing Director, Partner, Beacon Global Strategies. We thank you. Coming up on Balance of Power, the Trump administration claims it did not violate a court order by expelling hundreds of alleged members of a Venezuelan gang to El Salvador over the weekend. We'll bring you details of this legal battle next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The president, through proclamation, took his authority under Alien Enemies Act and imposed it, which he has the right to do. To turn a plane around over international waters, we're going to refuel over international waters, come back and bring terrorists back to the United States. That's not what this president promised the American people. What the president did was exactly the right thing.
What do you say to those who claim you're using a 200-year-old law to circumvent due process?
An old law? Not as old as the Constitution. We still pay attention to that, don't we?
The president's border czar, Tom Homan, in the White House driveway earlier today defending the administration's decision to deport hundreds of alleged Venezuelan gang members to El Salvador. This took place over the weekend, even as a federal judge ordered a halt to some of those deportations. Joining us now, Bloomberg's Sara, who has her eyes on a court hearing that's underway right now. It's great to have you back at the table. We're talking about 238 detainees said to be members of a violent criminal gang from Venezuela. As you just heard from the border czar, that airplane was over international waters when the judge made the ruling at 7 o'clock on Saturday night. The White House did not turn it around. Did it violate a court order is the question tonight.
So the tension is escalating, obviously, between the administration and this judge in particular. He's holding a hearing right now. He's saying he's not going to make a ruling, but he's on a fact-finding mission to find out from the administration what exactly happened and was his order defied. So nobody has expressly said it's been defied. The administration has said they did not defy the order. But there were two rulings yesterday afternoon. One was an oral ruling where the judge said in court, you know, turn those planes around if they're in the air. But there was no mention of turning planes around in the written order. So there's a little space between the two things. And the administration is saying that by the time he issued his order, they were not in violation of it.
Well, so I guess it raises this wider question, Sara, of what happens if they did defy the order. What consequence is there actually when they are the executive branch?
Well, this is the tension that has been ramping up now over the preceding weeks. We have now over 100 cases that have been filed across the country challenging Trump's agenda. And this is obviously a very aggressive agenda. In this case, it's to crack down on immigration. He's taking no prisoners, literally, and he is moving forward saying that he has the power. You know, we're at the moment where we're looking at the power of the executive versus the power of the courts.
If he's not going to make a ruling in this hearing tonight, when do we expect one? Do we know?
There are more briefings coming on Tuesday. This is now at an appeals court level, and so there will be more action on this to come.
Could ultimately end up at the Supreme Court,
and we think it's potentially on a fast track to the Supreme Court.
Yet again, that's quite a pipeline.
Yes.
From this administration to the Supreme Court. How long would that take, for instance? The Supreme Court does not need to rule immediately on something like that, and these detainees are already in another country.
Well, this would come through what we call the shadow docket, so it's not an opinion in a case that has, arguments and reasoning. One or the other side would go to the Supreme Court, depending on what happens at the appeals court level, and then they can make a decision on how they're going to handle it. So it could move fast.
Yeah, all right. Okay. Well, and Bloomberg's Sara Forden will stay on top of it for us. Thank you so much. Still ahead, Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, is making his pitch for closer European alliances in an effort to reduce dependence on the U.S. We'll have more with Ruby Dhalla, former Canadian Parliament member, next on Bloomberg.
You know that there are no guarantees. Like who would have predicted COVID, right? So I can predict that we are putting in robust policies that will be durable. And could there be an adjustment? Because I tell you that this massive government spending that we'd had, that if that had kept going, we have to wean our country off of that. And on the other side, we are going to invigorate the private sector.
Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on NBC's Meet the Press Sunday morning on the prospect of a recession. Now this morning, disappointing retail sales in February, adding to concerns of a pullback in consumer spending in the U.S. Retail sales rose less than forecast. January data revised lower to mark the biggest drop since July of 2021. And joining us now with more on this, Bloomberg's Enda Curran. On a Fed week, it's good to see you. How real is this retrenchment? Does it feed into this talk of a recession?
It's not signaling a disaster or anything, but it does suggest consumers are pulling back. When you look at the details across the board, there was a pullback in spending on cars that was expected to have rebounded. There was a pullback in spending on gasoline, a pullback in spending on electronics, on clothing, on eating out and going to the restaurants. I mean, there's only so far you can go without saying that, hang on, surely this data is pointing that consumers are getting a bit more nervous now than they were even a few months ago. The question is the extent of that slowdown. How steep will the slowdown be from here? We've had those indicators recently warning from the University of Michigan that consumer inflation expectations are skyrocketing, and of course consumer sentiment is going the opposite direction. So when you add it all together, as I say, it's no disaster, but when you listen to the comments from companies and what the data and spending is suggesting, it does say consumers are pulling back a little bit.
So what does it all mean for the Fed on Wednesday, if not actually influencing the rate decision they're ultimately expected to make, which is to do nothing, make no changes? The kind of tone and the language we're likely to hear from Chairman Powell as he tries to explain this economic situation.
Yeah, so no change expected from the Fed in terms of its interest rate this week. But people are looking out for when will the language and messaging start to change, because the Fed up to now has been saying we have to wait and see what policies will be announced by the administration and how it impacts the economy. That's of course fine. But we have had a lot of policies announced now, and some actually are implemented, especially on the trade front, with the tariffs in China, for example, and Mexico and Canada to some extent. And of course, we've got the DOGE spending code. So the thinking is, when will the Fed start running the numbers on this and start telling us how much of an economic impact they will expect it to have? Obviously, they don't want to get caught up in the politics of it, but the economics of it will be hard to deny at some point soon.
But hard to specify as well, right? If you don't know exactly what's going to happen April 2nd, we're still talking to Canada and Mexico, and it's unclear exactly where we're going to be a couple of months from now.
It's very early in the process still. I think the one point lots of people will agree on, it's the uncertainty that's hurting business. They don't want to invest, they don't want to expand right now, and consumers are getting a little bit wary, as we saw in the data. To be clear, the administration says this is bumps in the road until we get up and running, lots of investment and jobs will be created. But right here, right now, I think a lot of confusion is a dominant theme.
All right, Bloomberg's Enda Curran, thank you so much. Now, on the subject of tariffs, in an effort to combat Trump's global tariff threats and shore up unity with European allies, Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, making his first foreign trip, meeting with France's President Emmanuel Macron in Paris and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer in London. This is what Carney had to say after his meeting with Macron.
I want to ensure that France and the whole of Europe works enthusiastically with Canada, the most European of non-European countries, determined like you to maintain the most positive possible relations with the United States. Canada is a reliable, trustworthy, and strong partner of France, which shares our values and lives them through action during this age of economic and geopolitical crises.
Joining us now is Ruby Dhalla, former Canadian Parliament member and president and CEO of the Dhalla Group. Welcome to Bloomberg, Ruby. It's great to have you. When we consider Mark Carney, who has just stepped into this role as Prime Minister, is his primary job now fixing the relationship between the U.S. and that alliance, or instead shoring up other alliances so he can counter the United States?
I think the first priority for the Prime Minister of Canada has to be to fix the relationship to the biggest threat that Canada and the Canadian economy is facing, and that is with the United States of America. I know that many Canadians were hoping that the first call that would have been made by the Prime Minister and the first visit made by the Prime Minister would have been to the President of the United States, Mr. Trump, because the issue of tariffs, of taxes that are being imposed on Canadian businesses and the Canadian economy are of a grave concern to Canadians and Canadian families throughout Canada.
Well, so what do you think of the Secretary of State weighing in on this? Asked by reporters in Canada about the whole 51st state idea, he referred to it as a disagreement between the two countries. Did this just get worse?
Well, I think it's gone slightly beyond, a disagreement. It's starting to have a domino impact on businesses, on families, and on economies, not only here in Canada, but also in America as well. When you start to tax dairy, what happens? The prices of eggs go up. When you start to tax grains, what happens? The prices of food go up. When you start to tax lumber that's coming into America, what happens? The prices of homes actually go up. When you start to tax oil, You have the prices of gas going up. You start to tax energy and the prices of utilities are going up. So all of a sudden, all of these tariffs that are being imposed on Canadian products coming into the United States are starting to have an impact on American families. I was just reading a study today that the visitors that are coming into the United States internationally, Canadians actually comprise 11% of the total number of international visitors and contribute almost $20 billion in a year to the American economy through their visits. And guess what? The U.S. travel companies are reporting a 40% drop of visitors coming into the United States from Canada. So I think that these tariffs that are being imposed by America are going to start having a domino effect and impact of issues for American families, American businesses, and also Canadian businesses and Canada as a whole.
Well, to that point, Ruby, it's one thing to consider the economic consequence domestically in the U.S., another to consider it domestically in Canada. How far, realistically, can Canada go in retaliation against U.S. tariffs without doing too much damage to Canadian families and Canadian businesses?
Well, I think the retaliation is going to start to play out, you know, for every dollar that the United States has put a tariff on, Canada has shot back. We saw a $30 billion worth of tariffs that were put on April 2nd. I think the American president has announced there will be a further set of tariffs, and Canada has announced that they're going on to put another, you know, $60 billion worth of tariffs to goods that are going to be going into the United States. We take a look at steel and aluminum tariffed at 25%. We take a look at alcohol as an example. Ontario, the government is the #1 buyer, of the alcohol, not only for North America, but globally. And guess what? All of the alcohol products that are being produced in America have been taken off the shelves out of all of the liquor stores here in Ontario. The procurement contracts, the City of Toronto today just announced that above a certain limit, only Canadian companies will qualify, and American companies will no longer be able to provide those contracts and those goods to the city itself. So when you start to have cities and provinces make decisions where the procurement is only going to be done made in America, made in Canada, buy in Canada as their approach, it's going to start to have an impact, I think, on America. But make no doubt about it, for every tariff that is put on for Canada, it's going to impact our economy. And ultimately, who does it impact on both sides of the border in both countries? It impacts real people who have jobs, because if you have these factories and these plants starting to shut down, people are going to lose their jobs. So I think that the impact on both sides of the border will be there, but that will start to be realized in the weeks and the coming months.
Yeah, well, Ruby, what the White House would tell you is if Canada brought down its tariffs to begin with, we wouldn't be having this conversation. How do you respond?
Well, the one thing that I was saying, I was actually running as a prime ministerial candidate in the campaign to become prime minister against Mark Carney. And the one policy that I was putting forward throughout the entire campaign was that it's so important to negotiate. And I was sharing that Donald Trump, ultimately, even though he is president, he's a businessman. And myself as a businesswoman, I think that it is so incredibly important that the leadership of the country actually sit down and negotiate a deal. A lot of these tariffs and these taxes and this tariff war is actually being fought through social media. We see messages being posted on Truth Social or on X, or there's these media advisories that come out with the respective tariffs that are being put on by the countries. What is actually required to negotiate a deal is a sit down, a face-to-face, and let's do it the old-fashioned way. Let's discuss the issues, that are in play. Let's discuss the concerns that the president has. Let's discuss the issues and the concerns that the Canadian leadership and the Canadian government has, and let's shake hands and let's do a deal in which both countries can actually win. Because when you talk to people on both sides of the border, there's a lot of history there as friends, as allies, and I think that's what people want moving forward, is for both of the countries to prosper by working together.
It's good to have you. Ruby Dhalla, former Canadian Parliament member, President, CEO of the Dhalla Group. We thank you. Coming up, President Trump claims that President Biden's last-minute pardons of members of Congress who investigated the January 6th insurrection were void because they were signed with an Autopen. We'll play it to our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The whole subject of Autopen, did he know what he was doing? Did he authorize it? Or is this somebody in an office, maybe a radical left lunatic, just signing whatever that person was?
Are those executive orders, those pardons from the former president now null and void?
Well, I think so. It's not my decision. That'll be up to a court. But I would say that they're null and void, because I'm sure Biden didn't have any idea that it was taking place.
President Trump over the weekend on Air Force One there talking about a new target, the so-called Autopen, the device that has been used by presidents of both parties to sign documents remotely. The president furthering his point here in a Truth Social post calling President Biden's last-minute pardons, quote, void, vacant, and of no further force or effect, unquote. The comments suggesting the Trump administration may attempt to prosecute some of the president's biggest political adversaries, including those involved in the January 6th committee in the House. Joining us now with their thoughts on this and more, our political panel this evening, Bloomberg contributor, Democratic analyst Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, and Republican strategist Doug Heye, back with us at the table, former communications director for the RNC. It's great to have you both here. Doug, we've missed you. Welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
You've been through a few of these rounds with the Autopen, and people get outraged about it. The Heritage Foundation was even taking to social media to show a different version of the signature when Joe Biden announced his plans to step down. Is there something real here?
Yeah, I've used an Autopen, and I will tell you it was in the early 90s was the last time I used an Autopen. Basically, they're big and bulky, and I don't think anybody's used them since we had actual printers that could print signatures.
How about that?
So if you get a letter from your congressman, he probably didn't sign it. But the challenge, I think, for Republicans, and I heard this from a couple of congressional Republicans in the past day or so, is as typical with Donald Trump, he talks about extraneous things to where they're at and where their voters are at. No one in America really cares about this. This isn't what they were talking about. And if you look at the polling that we saw just over the weekend from NBC, Donald Trump, for the first time in his life, is underwater on the economy. So if I'm advising the president, I'd say, we've heard a whole lot about eggs over the past 6-8 weeks. Egg prices have fallen every week for the past 4. Donald Trump did really well when he went to that fast food restaurant in the campaign. Send him to a grocery store. Have him buy some eggs. Get back to the issue that he's underwater on right now and that voters care about the most.
Yeah, remember during the campaign at Bedminster, he had like the entire grocery store lined up behind him for one event. Jeannie, so to Doug's point on the kind of what resonates ultimately with the American electorate here, will they care? Will he have political cover if he were to decide to go after Liz Cheney or Adam Kinzinger, people who had received pardons with this supposed Autopen signature? Do people actually care about that still?
Doug seems to have forgotten that just the other day, Donald Trump was like tweeting whatever he's doing about shut up about the eggs. So I don't think we're going to see him out at the store buying eggs unless he's turned his head around. I don't think people care much, but I don't think Donald Trump cares if they care or not. This is a reflection of the fact that Donald Trump is on a revenge tour. And again, the public be damned. He should be focusing on the economy. To Doug's point, his numbers are underwater there. And people are genuinely concerned about what is coming down the pike economically, cost of living, inflation, these tariffs. So he's trying to turn the page on that. But more importantly, he wants revenge on Liz Cheney and everybody who he thinks wronged him. And if that means he has to diminish the pardon power under Joe Biden, he'll do that. And he will try to prosecute these folks and let the courts work it out whether an Autopen matters or not. But this is Donald Trump's revenge tour, and he is committed to it.
I feel like there's an opportunity here for DocuSign, maybe a new ad campaign. Doug, I want your thoughts, speaking of the courts, on a hearing that's underway right now about these detainees who were put on an airplane and sent, even though they're purportedly from Venezuela, as members of a criminal gang sent to El Salvador. There was a court order to turn that plane around. The White House chose not to pursue that because it was over international waters. Not sure how this is going to turn out legally, but politically, that's your specialty. This plays well with Donald Trump supporters.
It does. So if Donald Trump is underwater on the economy right now, he is doing very well on the issue of immigration. So well, in fact, that we see that there's no real activity happening with INS and immigration officials and at the border. The border police aren't doing much because no one's coming over at this point. So he can declare a victory here. And when voters see the images that they've seen just over the past day or so, this resonates not only with his message, but people who want the situation cleaned up. And here's where he can take credit in ways that he can't on other issues.
Well, I think the question people are asking, though, Jeannie, is whether the cost of cleaning it up means actually disregarding the system of checks and balances. Once again, you're hearing the phrase constitutional crisis thrown out there at the idea that the executive branch may be ignoring the orders of the judicial.
Absolutely. And, you know, speaking of images, let's just look at the images. Everybody should go look at President Bukele's supermax prisons. They are literally concrete slabs with men piled on top of each other, one after the other, after the other, after the other. And these 100-plus people that were sent down there, maybe not defying a judge's order, depending on what the court determines, we still don't know their status. Were they members of this gang? Did they commit any crimes in the United States? In the United States, we don't ignore due process. We find out. We see if you have been alleged to have committed a crime. We charge you. So I do think the American people will care about this, because if you don't care about the liberties and the freedoms of everybody, yours will be next. That's something we're taught as kids. And so I don't see this as politically a smart activity for the president to engage in. And that is why I think, by the way, he is saying he's not defied a court order. And we'll have to see what the judge decides.
You see, the president of El Salvador, President Bukele, took to Twitter and wrote, "Oopsie, too late." That was retweeted by members of the administration, including the communications director, making it somewhat official. Is that going a little far?
It's certainly unprecedented in global diplomacy. But what Donald Trump is doing here is he is testing the limits of executive power on sort of every issue that you can imagine. And this comes not just at a moment of where Trump is ascendant, but it comes after generations of Republican Congresses and Democratic Congresses ceding power from Congress, even though Congress is mentioned first in the Constitution as Article 1, ceding their own powers to the president. So whether it was under Obama or Trump or Bush or Clinton or what have you, Donald Trump has arrived at this moment able to do a lot of these things. We'll find out how far he can go because of this. And ultimately, regardless of who the next president is, the next president will have more powers because of Donald Trump's presidency.
Well, and when we consider the role of Congress in this, Jeannie, that's why Democrats, some of them, are incredibly upset with what they saw go down last week. And Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer ultimately supporting a continuing resolution that Democrats had no role in negotiating. So much upset, in fact, that he had to cancel his book tour, which was supposed to kick off this evening. What is he going to walk into when he comes back to Washington after recess next week?
He's in a really tough position, and the poll numbers on this are pretty stark. I mean, Democrats are very unhappy, and I was struck by the fact that about 3/4 of them are saying they want their party and their party leaders to fight. They do not want them to compromise anymore, and that is quite a turn. That's how much Elon Musk, Donald Trump, and what's happened in the last 8 weeks have gotten under their skin. And while I do think that Chuck Schumer made the right decision, he meandered, he made it in the wrong way, and he is paying the price. And I do think at some point going forward, he may be challenged in terms of his leadership of the Democratic Party in the Senate. And while it's a long way off, I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and some others are thinking of primarying him when his seat is up. Now, that's a long way off, Kaylee, so I won't go there, but he's got a long road ahead.
Let's not fast forward to 2028 quite yet. We still have a lot of 2025 to go before we even get to the midterms in 26. Doug Heye and Jeannie Shanzano, our political panel this evening. Thank you both so much. And coming up, President Trump says he'll speak with Vladimir Putin tomorrow as part of a truce push between Ukraine and Russia. We'll look ahead to that conversation next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Tomorrow I'm speaking with President Putin of Russia to save some soldiers who are in deep trouble. They're captured. Essentially, they're surrounded by Russian soldiers. I believe if it wasn't for me, they wouldn't be here any longer. I was able to get them not to do anything at this moment. But it's a bad situation in Russia, and it's a bad situation in Ukraine.
President Trump speaking earlier today, saying he will speak with Russian President Vladimir Putin tomorrow to discuss ending the war in Ukraine. We understand, based off of President Trump's remarks today, that this will be a conversation that happens in the morning. Who knows how long it will go, but we know, of course, the discussion subjects on the table.
Yeah, you'll want to join us tomorrow, noontime Balance of Power on YouTube and on Bloomberg Radio, and at 1 p.m. Eastern time here on Bloomberg TV, with much more to discuss as we follow this important meeting. You can find more about it in the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and Radio.